There is a particular kind of cold that the people of Shannon County, Arkansas, do not speak about the way people speak about storms or floods or other things the sky does to remind you of your position in the order of things. They do not speak about it because speaking about it requires remembering it, and remembering it requires returning, for a moment, to the winter of 1886 into 1887, which is a place that most of the people who lived through it would prefer to visit only when necessary, and only briefly, and only in the presence of someone who understands what they are being asked to revisit. I am Dr. Emmeline Foss. I have practiced medicine in this county for 31 years, and I have delivered 411 children, set more broken bones than I keep count of anymore, and sat with more dying men and women than I will describe to you now, because that is not the story I am here to tell. I tell you the number only so that you understand the ground from which this story grows. I have seen a great deal of what cold does to the human body and to the bodies of the animals that human bodies depend upon, and I have learned to read a hard winter the way a riverboat pilot reads a channel. Not with fear exactly, but with the specific attention of someone who knows the difference between navigable and not. The winter of 1886 was not navigable by the methods most people in this county were using. By the time it was over, and it did not feel during the worst of it as though it would ever be over, we had lost, by my count, a man named Elbert Crane's father to exposure a mile from his own cabin door, 3 cases of frostbite severe enough to require amputation, and enough livestock across the bottomlands and hill farms of Shannon County to represent, in the plain language of frontier economics, the difference between families who would plant again in the spring and families who would not. I am telling you this in 1910. 23 years is long enough to see a thing clearly. It is also long enough to understand that some of what happened that winter has not been written down anywhere, and that the people who lived it are aging, and that the specific knowledge that saved a number of those families, their animals, their livelihoods, their ability to remain on land they had broken their bodies to hold, is in danger of disappearing the way most practical knowledge disappears, not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly. As the people who carry it in their hands grow old and stop building things, I will not let it disappear without a record. The record begins with a woman named Sigrid Lund. She had come to Shannon County with her husband Lars in 1869, following the pattern of Scandinavian families in those years. Iowa first, where the land was already spoken for by the time they arrived with their saved passage money and their English learned from a book on the ship, and then south and west, deeper into the country, following the price of land downward until the price matched what they had. What they found in Shannon County was 80 acres on a south-facing slope above the current river, covered in oak and hickory, and the kind of thin rocky soil that requires 2 or 3 years of working before it concedes to produce anything, and that never fully stops reminding you that it was forest before it was farmland, and intends to return to forest if you give it the opportunity. Lars Lund was a quiet man of the kind the frontier produces in one of 2 ways. Either it makes a man quiet by breaking something in him that does not heal, or it makes him quiet by confirming something in him that does not need to speak. Lars was the second kind. He was not taciturn from damage. He was taciturn from sufficiency. He understood enough of what the land required of him to spend most of his days doing it rather than describing it. His wife, I believe, was the only person to whom he spoke freely, and she was the only person who required it of him, and so the arrangement was complete. Sigrid was not quiet in the same way. She was quiet in the way of a person who has learned that most rooms do not want what she knows, and has made a practical decision about when to offer it and when to keep it in reserve. She had grown up in Telemark, in the hill country of Norway, the daughter of a husband, a tenant farmer who worked steep land and built things to last in a climate that tested everything he built. She had watched her father construct, when she was 12 years old, a winter barn sunk 3 feet into the south face of a hill. its walls packed with the dense clay of the Norwegian hillside, its roof weighted with rye straw and a coat of mud that sealed it against the kind of cold that does not ask permission before it enters. That barn was warmer than the farmhouse. Every January of her childhood, she had understood this as a fact, the way a child understands facts that are demonstrated rather than explained. The barn was built that way, and so the animals lived, and so the family survived the winter, and so the spring came and the work continued. She did not know when she was 12 that she was memorizing something. She did not know in 1869, when she came to Arkansas, that she was carrying something. She had simply grown up knowing a thing the way you know the way home, not as knowledge exactly, but as orientation. Lars died in February of 1884, pneumonia, after a wet winter that kept him working in damp wool for 6 weeks without sufficient drying time between. He was sick for 9 days and then he was gone, and Sigrid was 52 years old with 80 acres, 6 dairy cows, 12 sheep, a kitchen garden, a root cellar that she had dug and stocked herself, and 2 sons in Springfield who wrote letters at regular intervals suggesting that she come to live with them. She read each letter when it arrived. She put each one in the stove, not out of anger, not out of stubbornness precisely, though I have heard people in this county describe her as stubborn, and I have never fully corrected them because stubborn is not entirely wrong. She burned the letters because the letters were based on an assumption she did not share, that the farm was Lars's argument, and that without Lars the argument was over. For Sigrid, the farm was the argument she and Lars had made together over 23 years of breaking ground and building structures and learning what this particular soil would produce and what it required in return. The farm did not stop being the argument because one of the arguers was gone. It only meant she had to make it alone now, in a voice that was only hers. She had been making it alone for 2 years when September of 1886 arrived and brought with it the signs she knew how to read. I should tell you about those signs because they are part of the story and because they speak to something that I have thought about for a long time as a physician, the difference between the knowledge that lives in instruments and the knowledge that lives in a body. My thermometers, my barometers, my medical texts from the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, these are instruments of knowledge and I trust them, and I would not practice medicine without them. But there is another kind of knowledge that does not live in instruments. It lives in the accumulated attention of people who have watched a particular environment long enough to recognize its grammar. Sigrid Lund had been watching cold country all her life. She spoke its grammar without knowing she spoke it. In September of 1886, she observed the following. The gray squirrels on her slope were carrying more than usual, not more food. More fur. The coats she saw on the squirrels moving through the hickory canopy above her woodpile were thicker than any she had noted in 15 years of watching them. She did not make a written record of this. She did not need to. The migratory birds moved south 2 weeks ahead of the schedule she had learned to expect. The schedule she had learned to expect was itself the product of 15 years of watching. She noted the absence, the specific quiet of a hollow where there should still have been movement, the way a doctor notes an absence of sound in a chest that should be producing it. There was a quality to the morning air in the last weeks of September that she described to me later, searching for the English word and not quite finding it, settling finally on the word bone dry, a dryness in the cold air that in Telemark had meant deep winter coming from the north, from the ocean side, the kind of cold that did not come with snow because the air was too dry to carry snow, and arrived instead as a clarity, a brightness, a silence. She stood before her barn in the first week of October, the barn she and Lars had built in 1872, built the Ozark way, split log walls, and a shingle roof and gaps between the boards that daylight showed through in thin, bright lines. And she looked at it the way you look at something you built yourself, when you understand that it is no longer adequate to the task you are asking of it. The barn would hold in a normal winter. She knew this because it had held in normal winters for 14 years. What was coming was not a normal winter. She knew this the way she knew it was going to rain before the clouds arrived, not as a prediction, but as a recognition. She went to Harlan Beats's general store the following Saturday to purchase cornmeal and salt and a small quantity of lamp oil. And while Harlan was weighing the cornmeal, she mentioned, in the same tone she might have used to mention that the creek was running high, that she intended to build a new shelter for her cattle before the cold arrived. Harlan Beats was a fair man and a patient storekeeper who had extended credit to half the farms in the county at one point or another, and who possessed, as a consequence of decades of watching families lose things they could not afford to lose, a reasonable, practical intelligence about what the frontier required. He asked what kind of shelter she had in mind. She described it as best she could in the English that still carried, after 25 years, the particular precision of a language learned in full adulthood. Choosing each word deliberately, the way you choose a tool from a rack, picking up each one and considering its weight before you use it. She described the slope, the orientation, the depth of the excavation, the thickness of the walls. Harlan listened. He was a good listener in the way that storekeepers learn to be good listeners, which is to say he listened long enough to understand what he was being asked before he responded to it. When she finished, he said, "That's a considerable amount of work for one person before the first freeze." She agreed that it was. He said, "The Patton brothers up on the ridge built their barn into a hillside about 10 years back. Didn't do much for them, as I recall." She said the Patton brothers had used green pine boards inside a shallow cut and had not addressed the walls at all. She said she was not proposing what the Patton brothers had done. Harlan nodded in the way of a man who is not disagreeing and is not agreeing, but is noting that a thing has been said, and filed it under the category of wait and see, which is a category that stores a great deal of frontier information before it gets sorted into either right or wrong. Bertie Crane was at the counter when this conversation happened, waiting for her own order of flour and dried beans. She was 38 years old, with 4 children and a husband who went to the Missouri mines every spring and came back every fall, and left her to manage the 3 cows and the kitchen garden and the children for the 6 months in between. She was not a woman with leisure for opinions about other people's building projects. She had listened to the conversation with the detached attention of someone waiting for it to be over. Later that week, she walked past Sigrid's slope on her way home from the store and stopped at the fence line. The excavation had already begun. A trench running across the face of the slope, 3 feet deep where Sigrid had finished, shallower where she was still working, the red Arkansas clay piled in neat rows beside the cut, the work proceeding with the methodical steadiness of someone who had calculated what needed to be done and was doing it in the correct order. Bertie looked at it for a while. Then she looked at Sigrid, who was in the trench with a mattock working the hard clay with the short, efficient strokes of someone conserving effort without sacrificing result. Bertie did not say anything because there was nothing particular to say. She walked the rest of the way home and wrote a letter to her husband that evening. And in the letter she mentioned, among the other news of the county, that the Norwegian widow on the slope above the river was digging something into her hillside that looked, from the fence line, like the beginning of a very large and carefully considered grave. She did not mean it unkindly. She was simply describing what she saw. What she saw was a woman of 54 years working alone in a trench in October, building something that no one in Shannon County had built before, against a winter that had not yet announced itself to anyone but her. What she could not see, what none of them could see yet, was what the woman in the trench was carrying. Not just the knowledge, though the knowledge was the thing that would matter, but the 23 years of argument she was still making, the 80 acres that were the evidence, the letters she had read and burned without once considering, not for a single morning, going to Springfield. The trench was 2 feet deep at the south end and 3 feet at the north. The cold was coming. Sigrid Lund picked up her mattock and went back to work. Before I describe what Sigrid Lund built, I want to describe how she thought about what she built. Because the building and the thinking are not the same thing, and most people, when they hear this story, attend to the building, the physical dimensions, the materials, the labor, and miss the thinking entirely, which is a shame, because the thinking is the part that cannot be reproduced by simply copying what she did. The thinking began, as most useful thinking begins, not with an idea, but with a problem. The problem was not, as you might suppose, how do I keep my animals warm? Every farmer in Shannon County was asking that question every October, and most of them answered it adequately with straw bedding and body heat, and the reasonable assumption that a normal winter would not exceed the tolerances of a reasonably constructed barn. Sigrid's problem was more specific. Her problem was, what do I know about cold that the people around me do not know, and is that knowledge applicable here, in this soil, in this climate, in this latitude, with these materials, at this particular moment in October of 1886, when I have perhaps 6 weeks before the cold I am predicting arrives, and I am 54 years old and working alone? That is a different question. It is a harder question, and the answer to it was not a new idea. It was an old idea that required translation. The old idea was her father's barn. I have already told you that she watched him build it when she was 12, in Telemark, in the hill country of Norway. What I have not told you is the specific quality of that memory, what kind of thing it was to carry, and how it presented itself to her mind in October of 1886 when she needed it. It did not present itself as a plan. It did not present itself as a set of instructions or a blueprint or a sequence of steps she could simply reproduce. It presented itself the way most embodied knowledge presents itself, as a felt sense of correctness, a physical memory of watching her father's hands, a recollection of sounds and smells, and the specific quality of the light on a Norwegian October morning, very much like the October morning she was standing in now. The memory was not verbal. It was procedural. The way riding a horse is procedural, the way you do not think about balance. You simply balance because your body learned it before your mind had words for it. What Sigrid had to do, and this was the hard work, harder in some ways than the physical labor that followed, was translate that procedural memory into a set of decisions she could make one at a time with the materials available to her. In soil, she had to learn to read the way her father had read Norwegian clay, which is to say, carefully, slowly, and with the understanding that the material would tell her what it required if she paid sufficient attention to what it was doing. The first thing she had to determine was whether the principle held. The principle, as her father had practiced it, was this: a structure built partially below the surface of a south-facing slope, with its 3 cold sides enclosed in dense, packed earth, would maintain a temperature inside that lagged significantly behind the temperature outside. Not because the earth was warm, it was not at the surface, not in the way a stove is warm or a fire is warm, but because the earth was slow. It changed temperature reluctantly, over days and weeks rather than hours, absorbing cold from the outside gradually and releasing whatever warmth had accumulated inside with the same deliberate pace. A wall of packed earth 3 feet thick did not keep cold out the way a wall keeps wind out, by physical resistance. It kept cold out the way a large body of water keeps cold out, by mass, by the sheer quantity of material that had to change temperature before the cold reached the interior. Her father had called it, in Norwegian, the principle of tregget, sluggishness, or more precisely, the resistance of a heavy thing to rapid change. He had not learned it from a book. He had learned it from his father, who had learned it from his, going back to a time before anyone had written it down or given it a name more technical than what it was. The simple observed fact that the earth, given sufficient depth and density, did not do what the air did. Whether it would work in Arkansas clay was a question she could not answer from memory. Norwegian clay and Arkansas clay were not the same material. She knew this because she had worked both of them with her hands, and the difference was apparent. The Arkansas clay was denser in some ways, more plastic, more inclined to hold its shape when wet. Whether it held the same thermal properties, whether it responded to cold and warmth with the same sluggishness, she did not know theoretically. She knew how to find out. You find out by building. She began each morning before the sun cleared the eastern ridge. The discipline of the farm did not pause for a building project. This is something I want you to understand because it changes the nature of what she accomplished. The 6 cows required milking at first light. The milk went into the tin cans she loaded onto the small cart and hauled twice weekly to Harlan Beats's store, where he bought it at 4 cents per quart for resale to the families in the hollow who did not keep dairy animals. This was the arithmetic of her winter. The milk bought the cornmeal and the lamp oil and the occasional length of rope or handful of nails that the farm required. The milk was not optional. The milking was not negotiable. So she milked first. Then she ate what there was to eat, cornbread from the previous evening, or cold beans, or in the better mornings, a fried egg from the 3 laying hens she kept in the corner of the existing barn. Then she went to the slope with her tools, and she worked until the light failed, and she went back inside and cooked whatever required cooking, and went to sleep and got up and milked again. This was the rhythm of those weeks. I do not describe it to make it seem heroic. I describe it because the omission of it, the failure to account for what a woman alone on a working farm is doing while she is also building something, is the failure that makes frontier stories feel like fables rather than history. She was not a woman in a story building something extraordinary. She was a woman in a life doing 3 things at once, as she had always done, as the frontier required. The digging was the first week. The site she had chosen was on the south-facing slope 30 yards below the main cabin, where the grade ran at approximately 30 degrees and the soil profile was what she expected. 8 to 10 inches of thin topsoil, dark and root-threaded, giving way to the dense red clay beneath that ran, as far as she could determine, to the limestone shelf some 15 feet below the surface. She did not need to go far into that clay. She needed 3 feet of it, the depth that experience, translated from her father's hands through her own, told her was the minimum for adequate thermal effect. She marked the rectangle with stakes and string, 14 feet wide along the slope, 8 feet deep into the hill. The rectangle was modest in its ambition and precise in its geometry. The first foot came away with reasonable effort. The second foot required the mattock rather than the spade. The clay at that depth was compressed by the weight of what lay above it, dense and unyielding in the dry of late October, and she had to break it before she could move it. She learned quickly that wetting the clay the evening before made it workable the following morning, and so each evening before she went in, she poured 4 gallons of creek water into the section she intended to work the next day, and each morning she returned to clay that had softened enough to cut. By the end of the first week, the rectangle was 3 feet deep across its full extent, the excavated clay piled in ordered rows to the east and west. The physical toll of this she did not describe to me directly. I am a physician. I can describe it for her. 7 days of mattock work in hard clay. For a woman of 54 who had been doing physical labor all her life, but had not, in the 2 years since Lars died, had reason to push herself to this particular extreme. Her hands, when I examined them the following spring, told me what that week had asked of them. But she did not stop. She worked to the pace the calendar required, not the pace her body requested. The frame went up in the second week. She used hickory, not pine, not the split oak that most Ozark barns relied upon, but hickory, which she had learned in 20 years of Arkansas winters did not shrink the way pine did when the cold and dry of February pulled the moisture from it. Pine boards shrink in cold, dry air and open gaps along every joint, and those gaps are where the wind enters, and wind, even a small and constant wind, negates entirely the effect she was trying to achieve. Hickory held its dimensions. She had 2 hickory trees she had been intending to fell for firewood, and she felled them now instead for lumber, and she split the planks herself with the froe and mallet that had been Lars's and that she had learned to use at his side. The frame went 5 feet high at its interior peak, enough for the animals to stand, not enough for her to stand without ducking, which she accepted as a fair trade. She sank the 4 corner posts a foot into the floor of the excavation, setting each one in a collar of tamped clay that she packed by hand around the base. The cross members she pegged rather than nailed in the Norwegian fashion, because she did not have enough nails and because a pegged joint, properly fitted, holds better across the freeze and thaw cycles of a cold winter than a nailed one, which the frost can work loose over the course of a season. When the frame was set, she stood inside it and looked up at the pale October sky through the open top, and felt for the first time since she had begun that the thing she was building had a shape. It was not yet what it needed to be, but it was no longer only an idea. The wall was where the ground corrected her. She began applying the earth on the 14th day, working the north face first because the north face was the most critical, the direction from which the worst cold would come, the face that needed to be thickest and most dense. She carried the excavated clay from the piles beside the trench, mixed it with water, to a consistency she judged by squeezing it in her palm. It should hold its shape, release cleanly from the hand, show no crumbling at the edges, and applied it in courses 6 inches deep, tamping each course with a length of hickory post before applying the next. The work proceeded. By the end of the 14th day, she had 3 courses on the north face, 18 inches of packed clay that stood without visible flaw and that, when she pressed her palm to it, felt solid in the way she expected, a solidity she could feel through her hand as much as see with her eyes. She went to bed satisfied. She returned in the morning to a crack. It ran diagonally across the face of the second course, 8 inches long, starting near the top of the course and running down and to the left at approximately 45 degrees. The clay on either side of the crack had shifted slightly, not dramatically, not enough to threaten the wall's integrity yet, but enough to be unmistakable. The crack had not been there the previous evening. She stood and looked at it for a long time. Then she pressed the clay on either side of the crack with her thumb, testing its give. She examined the base of the wall where it met the excavated floor. She stepped back and looked at the wall as a whole, looking for any sign of movement or settling that might explain a diagonal crack appearing overnight in clay she had tamped with sufficient care. She tried to repair it. She mixed fresh clay to the same consistency and worked it into the crack with her fingers, tamping it smooth, and let it sit until the following morning. In the morning, the repair had cracked again, the same line, the same angle, slightly longer now. She tried a different approach, wetter clay, packed more firmly, left to dry more slowly under a cover of straw. She worked it in the afternoon and weighted the surface with flat stones and went to bed with the particular wakefulness of someone who knows that a problem they have not yet diagnosed is continuing to develop without them. In the morning, the crack had opened along its full length and extended 2 courses further up the wall than before. She sat on the slope in the October air with the cracked wall in front of her. And she did not panic, because panic was a luxury she had not allowed herself since Lars died and had not particularly missed. But she understood that she was looking at something she did not fully understand, and that not understanding it was a problem of a specific kind, a problem that required her to remember something she might have been told and might not have been told, and might have observed without language and might never have seen at all. She thought through everything she knew about clay. She thought through the wall's construction, course by course, looking for the error. She considered the water content, the tamping force, the depth of the excavation, the angle of the slope. And then, from somewhere below the level of deliberate memory, from the place where her father's hand still lived in her own hands, where the Norwegian hillside still existed as a physical sensation rather than a recollection, a single word surfaced. Telly, the Norwegian word for what frost does to soil. The way ground that holds moisture will expand when it freezes, pressing outward from within, working against anything that tries to hold it. Her father had mentioned it once, early in the building of the barn she had watched him build, before she fully understood what she was watching. He had said, "You cannot use pure clay in a year with wet ground. The telly will work it open." She had been 12. She had filed the word without understanding it and then not retrieved it for 40 years. She retrieved it now, sitting on an October slope in Arkansas, looking at a diagonal crack in a wall she had spent 3 days building. He had mixed in river sand. 2 parts clay, 1 part sand. The sand opened the clay's structure enough to allow the moisture to move rather than accumulate, which meant the frost had less to work with, which meant the wall did not heave. The nearest river sand was the bed of the current river, 2 miles south. She stood up, went to the barn, took the canvas grain sack from its hook, and started walking. She made 3 trips to the current river. I want you to hold that fact for a moment before I move past it, because it is the kind of fact that is easy to read and difficult to truly imagine. 2 miles south on a slope that drops 400 feet in elevation before it levels into the river bottomland. 2 miles back, uphill the entire return, carrying 40 pounds of wet river sand in a canvas sack across her shoulders. 3 times. On the second and third trips, she already had the accumulated fatigue of the first in her legs and her lower back, the specific soreness of a 54-year-old body that has been asking more of itself than it has been asked in some years. She did not describe this to me as hardship. She described it to me as logistics. There was a material the wall required, the material was 2 miles away, and so she went and got it. This was the plainest possible description of what she did, and I believe it was also the most accurate description of how she thought about it. Not as endurance, not as determination in the inspirational sense, but as the simple arithmetic of a problem and its solution. The wall needed sand. She had legs. What I will add, because I was there for the beginning of the third trip and she was not aware that I observed it, she rested for 4 minutes at the top of the first rise on the return, her hand on the fence post at the corner of her upper pasture, the sack set down beside her feet, her head lowered. She was not in distress. She was simply being 54 years old, which is its own kind of work. Then she picked up the sack and continued. I did not call out to her. It was not a moment that wanted company. The mixing required experimentation. 2 parts clay to 1 part sand was what her memory had given her, and she began there, combining the materials with water in the shallow wooden trough she used for mixing feed supplements, working them together with the back of the spade until the mixture had a consistency she could not immediately name because she had not worked it in 40 years, and her hands had to remember it before her mind could describe it to her. The first batch was too wet. She could see this before she applied it. The mixture slumped when she scooped it, ran at the edges, would not hold the tight pack she needed. She added clay from the pile and worked it again. The second batch was closer. She tested it by the method she had used before. Take a handful, squeeze it firmly, open the hand. The correct mixture should hold the impression of the palm's lines, should not crack at the edges, should release from the skin cleanly without sticking. The second batch stuck. Too much clay relative to sand, and the plasticity was working against her. The third batch she adjusted by feel rather than by ratio, adding small amounts of each material and testing after each addition until she held a handful that behaved as she needed it to behave. She set the handful on the flat stone beside the trough and looked at it for a moment. Then she began applying. The new wall went up with a different quality than the first. Under the hickory post she used for tamping, the mixture packed with a sound she had not heard from the pure clay. A denser, less resonant sound, more like the thud of a closed fist on a table than the hollow knock of a half-full drum. She had not consciously remembered that sound until she heard it. When she heard it, she knew the mixture was right. She worked the north face first, then the east, then the west, applying each course in the same sequence. Wet the previous course lightly to improve adhesion. Apply the new course, tamp with the post in overlapping strokes, Let stand until the surface showed the first shallow checking cracks that meant the top had begun to dry, then apply the next course. 6 inches per course. 6 courses to achieve 3 feet of wall. The arithmetic was simple. The execution was not fast. Between courses she waited. This was perhaps the hardest part of the construction, not the mixing, not the tamping, not the trips to the river, but the waiting. She was a woman who had been moving since first light for the better part of 3 weeks, and the periods of enforced stillness while a course set enough to accept the next one had no productive use she could find for them except to sit and look at the slope and the sky, and think about what she still had to do and whether she had enough days to do it. She had, by her calculation, 11 days before the first hard freeze she expected. The walls took 6 days to complete, including 2 days lost to a brief warm rain that softened the finished courses and required her to protect them with canvas sheeting weighted at the edges with stones. The rain was warm enough to do no damage, cold enough to remind her that the calendar was not waiting. The roof was a different problem. She had decided early in her planning that the roof must do 2 things simultaneously. It must bear the weight of the earth she intended to lay over it, which meant it had to be structurally sound in a way a conventional shingle roof was not designed to be, and it must provide insulation of its own, which meant the structural layer could not simply be boards which conduct cold efficiently and without apology. Her solution was rye straw. She had 2.5 acres of rye she had grown the previous year, the stalks still sound and dry in the barn where she had stored them after threshing. In Norway. And here I am reporting what she told me, filling in the picture she gave me of her mother's knowledge as distinct from her father's. Rye straw roofing was laid not loose, but woven. Her mother had woven it into bound mats, overlapping them like the scales of a fish, each mat tied to the one below with a twist of the same straw. The whole assembly shedding water by its angle and its overlapping structure rather than by any single layer's impermeability. She had watched her mother do this. She had done it herself as a girl in the way children do labor alongside their parents. Imperfectly, slowly, learning not the finished technique, but the logic of it, the understanding of why the straw was oriented as it was, and why the overlap had to be a minimum of 4 inches, and why the binding twist had to be pulled tight enough to hold, but not so tight it cut through the straw's stem. She had not made a woven straw mat in 40 years. The first one took her the better part of a morning. The result was technically adequate and aesthetically irregular, the kind of thing a craftsperson would recognize as a beginner's work. The binding twists uneven in their tension, the overlap inconsistent in places, one corner where the straw had been laid at a slightly wrong angle and had to be unpicked and relaid. She set it aside and made another. The second was better. The third was the thing she remembered making, her hands finding the rhythm again the way hands do, the motion becoming its own authority. She made 11 mats over 3 days, working in the evenings by lamplight when the outdoor work had stopped, sitting in the cabin doorway with the straw across her lap and the lamp on the step beside her. The mats were 18 inches of compressed straw each, overlapping by 6 inches when laid, giving a finished roof thickness that varied between 24 and 30 inches, depending on the angle. Over the mats, she poured clay slurry. Clay worked with enough water to pour, but not so much that it would simply run off the slope of the roof before it could set. She added a small amount of dried grass to the slurry, as her father had done, to give it tensile strength as it dried, to prevent it from shrinking into cracks large enough to compromise its weatherproofing. She smoothed the surface with a flat board, working from the high side to the low side, and she left a gap at the roofline where it met the back wall, a 3-inch space she had planned deliberately, allowing the accumulated warmth of the animal's breath to escape rather than build to a moisture level that would rot the straw from within. When it was done, she stood below it on the slope and looked up at it, and it looked, as Bertie Crane had anticipated, like a hill. Like a piece of the slope that had been organized, like something that had always been there and had only recently been noticed. She allowed herself 1 full minute of looking at it. Then she went inside and ate supper and went to bed. November arrived and the temperature began its descent. Not dramatically. The Ozark autumn does not end the way a Norwegian autumn ends, with an abruptness that feels like a door slamming. It ends gradually, retreating, conceding degrees one at a time, as though hoping you will not notice the accumulation until it is already winter. 38 degrees in the morning by the first week of November. 32 by the second week, with the first light frosts appearing on the flat stones near the creek in the early hours before the sun cleared the ridge. Sigrid moved her animals into the new structure on the 12th of November. She led the cows in first. They went reluctantly, as cows go to any new enclosure, with the particular bovine suspicion of the unfamiliar that requires patience to overcome. She stood inside with them for an hour, letting them settle, letting them understand the space as safe. The sheep followed more readily. She latched the south-facing door and stood outside in the November morning and felt, for the first moment since she had begun, the absence of the specific anxiety that had driven the previous 6 weeks. It was done. Whether it was right was still a question, but the question was now answerable, which was better than it had been. She had borrowed a thermometer from my bag in October when she had come to my office for a minor matter of a hand infection from the construction work, the kind of wound that develops when a person works stone and clay without the benefit of gloves, which she did not own. I cleaned and dressed it and told her to come back in 5 days. She came back in 3, declared it sufficiently healed, and asked if she could borrow the thermometer for the winter. I said yes. She returned it in March, as I have already told you, with the instruction to keep it. She began taking readings on the 15th of November. Outside temperature at dawn, 29 degrees. Inside the new structure, 34 degrees. A 5-degree differential at low temperatures in the first days after introduction of the animals, before the walls had begun to absorb and hold the biological warmth accumulating inside. She recorded the readings in her farm accounts ledger, the same ledger where she tracked milk output and feed quantities and the small purchases from Harlan Beats's store. The temperature readings appear between entries for November corn prices and a notation about a loose shoe on the older of her 2 draft horses. No commentary, no exclamation. Just the date, the outside reading, the inside reading, and the difference. The differences grew, not quickly, not in the dramatic curve of something working beyond expectation, but steadily, with the reliable incrementalism of a process proceeding correctly, the way a well-banked fire grows, the way a field responds to the second year of correct management, the way anything behaves when the conditions for its proper function have been established and then simply left to operate. November 22nd, outside 17 degrees, inside 29, 12 degrees of difference. December 5th, outside 14 degrees, inside 31. 17 degrees of difference. The walls were not yet fully cured. She understood this. The thermal properties of packed earth improve as it dries and settles, as the clay particles align themselves into their most stable configuration, as the moisture that has been mixed and tamped and worked into the structure slowly migrates outward and leaves behind a denser, more insulative material than what she had started with. The walls would continue to improve through the winter. What she was seeing in November was the floor, not the ceiling, of what the structure could do. The sky changed in the second week of December. I noticed it first from the perspective of my patients, the complaints that present themselves as winter deepens, the joint pains that announce cold fronts before the cold fronts arrive, the particular quality of respiratory distress that tells a physician that the air is drying as well as cooling, that the moisture is leaving the atmosphere in the way it leaves before a deep and settled cold rather than a passing one. Sigrid noticed it differently. She told me later that the morning sky on the 14th of December had a color she associated from Telemark with what the Norwegian farmers called evig kulde, the permanent cold, the cold that comes not from a passing system, but from the settling of winter into its deepest register. the cold that has decided to stay. The color was a particular blue, pale, high, and completely clear, no clouds anywhere in the visible sky. The kind of blue that in temperate climates means fair weather, but in cold climates means the temperature has dropped below the point where the atmosphere can hold moisture, which means the cold is drier than normal cold, which means it penetrates differently, through clothing, through walls, through the gaps in structures that a wetter cold would announce with frost and ice. But this cold crosses silently, without the usual signals. She increased her evening fires in the cabin. She checked the barn door latch for fit. The hickory peg had swelled slightly with use, and she planed it back to a precise fit, tight enough to hold against wind, but not so tight it could not be opened quickly if needed. She brought an additional 2 weeks of firewood under the cabin's overhang. She checked the root cellar's insulating layer of straw. These were the acts of a woman who had read the sky correctly and was proceeding without drama. I have thought about that quality, the absence of drama, many times over the years, and I have decided it is one of the most important qualities a person can have on the frontier, and one of the least appreciated, because it does not make for memorable anecdote. The memorable anecdotes are about the crises, the last-minute survivals, the dramatic reversals. But the reason Sigrid had a dramatic reversal to offer anyone was that she had already done the undramatic work, the measuring, the calculating, the preparing 3 steps ahead of where she stood. By the 3rd week of December, the temperature readings from the new structure told a story that I still find remarkable in its plainness. December 22nd. Outside, -8 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the structure, 28 degrees, 36 degrees of difference, all 6 cows, all 12 sheep, alive, eating, drinking from the water bucket she refreshed each morning, the bucket brought from the cabin warm and set in the structure before the surface had time to skin over with ice. Outside that same morning, in Shannon County, 3 farms had already lost animals. I know because I was riding between them, treating what the cold had done to the people trying to save livestock that their shelters could not protect, frostbitten hands, a shoulder injury from a man who had slipped on ice carrying feed, the beginning of the respiratory illness that would worsen in 2 of those families before January was half done. I rode past Sigrid's slope on my way north. The new structure sat on the hillside in the pale December light, unremarkable, earthen, looking as it had always looked, like a piece of the slope that had been organized. From the track I could see the south-facing door latched. No sound from within, which was normal. No sign of distress, which was meaningful. I did not stop. I had patience waiting. But I noted it the way I note things that matter, not in the medical ledger, but in the part of the mind that keeps records of a different kind. Something was working on that slope. What I did not know, riding north that morning past the quiet earthen structure and the pale unremarkable sky, was that the cold had not yet arrived. What I did not know was that in 12 days, on the night of January 4th, the thermometer outside Sigrid Lund's cabin would read a number that Shannon County would talk about for the next 20 years. What I did not know was that on the night of January 5th at 3 in the morning, someone would come to her door. And what I could not have known, what none of us could have known, was that the sound of that knock in the cold and the dark would be the moment the story stopped being about one woman's barn and became something the whole county would carry forward. But that is the next chapter. For now, the sky was a particular blue. The cold had decided to stay. And on a south-facing slope above the current river, behind a door of fitted hickory, 6 cows and 12 sheep breathed in the dark, and the earth held what they gave it, and gave nothing back to the winter outside. The 4th of January, 1887, arrived without announcement. That is the nature of the deepest cold. It does not announce itself the way storms announce themselves, with wind and darkening sky, and the particular atmospheric pressure that people and animals feel in the hours before. It arrives in stillness. The air simply becomes what it has decided to become, and you understand what has happened only when you open the door in the morning and the cold enters the cabin not as a draft but as a presence, a solid and indifferent thing that has been waiting outside all night and has no particular urgency about its business because it intends to stay for a while. I had been up since before dawn attending a difficult delivery 6 miles east on the Sycamore Creek Road, the Halverson woman's third child, which arrived correctly and healthily at 4:30 in the morning, and I was on the road home by 5:30, riding in the dark with my coat buttoned to the throat and my hands in the heaviest gloves I owned, and I was cold in a way that I had not been cold in 20 years of Ozark winters. My thermometer, which I kept in my coat pocket against the chest to prevent the mercury from contracting, read -22 degrees Fahrenheit when I stopped to check it at the top of the Ridge Road. The wind from the northwest was running at perhaps 30 miles an hour, not a gale, but a steady and purposeful cold wind of the kind that finds every gap in a garment and every inadequacy in a structure and makes its presence known through both. I have said that this was the coldest night in 20 years. I will amend that now with the precision that 23 years of reflection allows. It was the coldest night in the recorded memory of Shannon County, which extended back to approximately 1847, when the first reliable weather observations began to be kept in this region. No one alive in 1887 had experienced a night of this temperature. We were in new territory. The only question that mattered practically on the morning of January 5th was what had survived it. The answer came in the way answers come on the frontier, not all at once, not in any organized fashion, but piecemeal, farm by farm, the news traveling the way all news travels in a rural county, through the people who had reason to be on the road that morning and who stopped at each farm they passed and exchanged information with the directness of people for whom information is not social currency, but survival currency. By the time I reached Harlan Beats's store at 9 in the morning, cold, tired, in need of hot coffee which Harlan kept on the stove through the winter months as a practical accommodation to the reality that cold people needed something warm before they could transact business usefully. By that time, the ledger of the night's losses was already being assembled. The Patton farm on the North Ridge, 4 cattle dead, frozen in the existing shelter which had not been adequate. The Brewer place at the bottom of the South Hollow, 2 cattle and all 7 sheep. The shelter there was a 3-sided structure open to the south, which had been sufficient in every previous winter and was not sufficient in this one. Old Ira Watkins on the Sycamore Creek Road, whose cattle I had seen the previous month shivering in a board barn that let daylight through its eastern wall, had lost six animals. He was, by Harlan's account, standing in front of his barn when his neighbor found him that morning, standing in the cold looking at what the night had done, in the posture of a man who has been told something he cannot yet fully accept. Harlan was recording these reports in his own ledger as they came in, not sentimentally, but with the practical accounting of a man who extends credit to farming families and needs to understand what the credit situation looks like after a night like this. He told me later that by noon he had recorded the loss of 31 cattle and an uncounted number of sheep across 14 farms in the county. 31 cattle represented in the economic arithmetic of Shannon County in 1887 a loss of something between $1,500 and $2,000, not as an abstraction, but as the specific capacity of those 14 families to plant, harvest, and survive the following year. I drank my coffee and listened to the reports coming in and thought about the thermometer I had lent to Sigrid Lund. Bertie Crane came into the store at 10:30 with the particular expression of a woman who has been awake since 3 in the morning and has something to say, but is not entirely certain how to say it. She told it plainly, which was her way. She had lost 2 cows before Christmas to the accumulating cold, not to a single catastrophic night, but to the steady drain of a cold that exceeded her shelter's capacity over the course of 3 weeks. She had been down to 1 cow, her best milker, an 8-year-old Guernsey that she had kept alive through December by the addition of extra bedding and her own body heat on the worst nights, sleeping in the barn, which was not something she advertised because it was the kind of thing that invited comment. On the night of January 4th, she had understood by midnight that the Guernsey would not survive until morning in the existing shelter. The cow was shivering in the deep, involuntary way that means the cold has gotten past the surface and is working on the core, the way I have seen men shiver when hypothermia has progressed beyond the early stage. She had gone to Sigrid Lund's door at 3 in the morning. I will not reproduce her account of that conversation at length, because I have already given it to you in the way Sigrid gave it to me, and Bertie's version was consistent with Sigrid's in every particular that mattered. What I will add is what Bertie said next, standing in Harlan Beats's store that January morning, which is the part of her account that I have returned to most often in the years since. She said, "I put my hand on that wall this morning, the inside wall, not near the animals, the back wall, the one that's just earth and nothing else. And it was warm. Not like a stove, not like anything I've felt before, exactly. More like," she paused, searching, "more like putting your hand on a living thing." Harlan looked up from his ledger. "The wall was warm," he said. "The wall was warm," Bertie said, "and my cow is alive. And I don't entirely understand why, but I know those two things are connected. I want to be precise about what was happening in that wall, because imprecision here leads to a misunderstanding of what Sigrid built, and the misunderstanding matters. The warmth in that wall was not geological. It was not the warmth of the deep earth, the ancient and stable temperature of stone and soil at depth that maintains itself regardless of season. That warmth exists. It is the warmth that limestone caves maintain at 52 degrees through summer and winter both. But it was not what Sigrid's wall was doing. What Sigrid's wall was doing was more active than that, and in some ways more remarkable because it had started from nothing. When she had finished building in November, the earth walls were cold. They were the temperature of the surrounding soil, which was the temperature of the autumn ground, which was somewhere in the upper 30s. They had no stored warmth. They were simply a material, clay and sand, packed dense, with a particular physical property. They changed temperature very slowly. What changed them was the animals. 6 cows produce collectively an enormous quantity of body heat. Each breath a cow exhales is warmer than the surrounding air. Each square foot of hide radiates warmth continuously. In a conventional board barn, this warmth rises, dissipates, escapes through every gap and imperfection in the structure, and is immediately replaced by cold air from outside. The animals generate heat. The barn loses it as fast as it is generated. The interior temperature never rises significantly above the exterior. In Sigrid's structure, the packed earth walls did not permit this. The warmth the animals generated could not escape quickly enough to prevent accumulation. It pressed against the earth walls, and the earth walls absorbed it, degree by degree, over days and weeks. Not because the earth was porous or receptive in any intuitive sense, but because every material has a capacity to store heat, and dense packed clay has a very large capacity relative to its volume. And that capacity, once filled, releases its contents with the same reluctance with which it received them. The animals had been filling that capacity since November. By January, the walls had absorbed 6 weeks of bovine warmth and were holding it the way a mill pond holds the summer's rain, silently, invisibly, with a depth you would not guess from the surface. Bertie Crane's hand on the wall at 5 in the morning on January 5th was feeling 6 weeks of accumulated breathing. The cows had warmed the earth. The earth refused to give that warmth back to the winter outside. That is a different thing from a warm rock or a warm cliff or the ancient heat of the deep ground. It is a bargain made between living things and the material that surrounds them, a bargain that had to be established over time, that had to be prepared for, that had to be built correctly from the beginning to function at all. Sigrid had built it correctly. And on the coldest night in the recorded memory of Shannon County, the bargain held. Casimir Wojcik came to the slope in the last week of January. He had heard about the structure through the particular information network of people who work with their hands, the way a carpenter hears about an unusual joint, or a mason hears about a foundation that held when others failed. He had heard it described by 3 different people in 3 different ways, all of them inadequate, and he had decided that inadequate description was a reason to look rather than a reason to dismiss. He walked 2 miles in 6 inches of snow at 71 years old and arrived at Sigrid's fence line at mid-morning. She saw him from the cabin window and came out. He did not explain himself. He said, "May I look at the structure?" She said yes. He examined it the way a builder examines things, not quickly, not with the cursory attention of a curious neighbor, but with the slow and methodical attention of someone reading a text they want to understand fully before they comment on it. He walked the full perimeter. He examined the corner joints where the north and east walls met, pressing the junction with his thumb, then with the flat of his hand. He looked at the roof edge where the clay had checked and settled through the winter's freeze and thaw. He went inside and stood for a long moment with his palm against the back wall. When he came out, he stood beside Sigrid in the January morning and looked at the structure in silence for a time. "The corner on the northeast," he said finally. "I would have battered it." Sigrid looked at the corner. Battered how? A slight lean inward, 3 degrees, perhaps 4. In a wet clay that freezes, the lateral frost pressure works against a plumb corner over time. He paused. "Your corner is holding now, but in 5 years, with this soil, I would batter it." Sigrid considered this. She looked at the corner for a moment with the specific attention of someone filing information correctly. "My father built plumb," she said. "His soil was different." "Different clay," Casimir said. "Same cold, perhaps, but different clay." A pause between them, not uncomfortable, but working. The pause of 2 people adjusting what they know. "When I build the next one," Sigrid said, "I will use batter." Casimir nodded once. He asked if he could bring a neighbor the following week to see it. She said yes. He walked home. That was the whole of it. No speech, no ceremony. 2 people who had spent their lives learning from materials, talking to each other about a material, making a small correction, and agreeing to move forward. By April, 7 people from 5 farms had come to watch Sigrid build the second structure, a smaller version for her sheep on the same slope 20 feet east of the first. She did not organize this. She simply built, and they came and watched and asked questions when they had them, and she answered the questions when she could and said, "I don't know," when she couldn't, which was itself a kind of instruction. The farmer named Deuce Billings built his own version in May, working from what he had seen. He used pure clay because he had not attended on the day she mixed the sand and had not thought to ask. His wall cracked in October when the first light frost reached the ground. He came back to Sigrid and described the cracks. She told him about the sand. He rebuilt in November correctly this time, and it held. This detail matters because it shows what the knowledge required to travel. It could not be copied from a distance. It could not be absorbed from a description. It had to be gotten wrong once, in some cases, before it could be gotten right, before the hands understood what the eyes had seen and what the words had tried to approximate. Deuce Billings' rebuilt wall was, in certain respects, better than his first attempt, because he understood it more completely than a person who had gotten it right on the first try. The error had been part of the instruction. By the winter of 1887 into 1888, a hard winter, but not the catastrophe that the previous one had been, 11 structures of this general type stood in Shannon County, none of them identical to Sigrid's original, each one adapted to its site and its builder's hands and the specific properties of the soil it was built from. Not one of them lost livestock to cold that winter. Harlan Beets noted the absence of debt renegotiations the following spring. He noted it in his ledger the way he noted everything, without commentary, in the plain language of accounts. But he mentioned it to me in passing, sometime in the late spring of 1888, standing in the store doorway on a warm afternoon, and what he said was, "The families that built the new way came through clean. I don't know exactly what to make of that, but I've written it down. I thought that was about as complete an accounting as the situation required. I am an old woman now, telling this to you in 1910, and I am aware that old women telling stories are expected to arrive, eventually, at the lesson. The moral. The thing it all amounts to. I will not do that, exactly. I do not think Sigrid Lund would have done it, and this is her story more than mine. What I will tell you is what I saw on a morning in late March of 1887, when I rode out to her farm to return the thermometer and found her standing in the early light outside the structure, the door open, the animals moving freely in and out, now that the winter had released them. I gave her the thermometer. She looked at it for a moment, the way you look at a tool when you are deciding whether you still need it, and handed it back to me. "Keep it," she said. "You'll need it more than I will. I know what it says." I put it in my coat pocket. I stayed for a cup of coffee. We did not talk much because Sigrid did not talk much in the mornings, and I had learned to respect her silences as a form of communication rather than an absence of it. When I left, I turned at the top of the rise and looked back. She was standing outside the structure with the door still open, and she was looking at the wall, the north wall, the one that had cracked and been rebuilt, the one that had held through the worst night in 20 years. She was not touching it. She was simply looking at it in the particular way of a builder examining something finished, checking the surface for the fine shallow cracks that appear in clay as it dries and settles. The cracks that mean failure if they are deep and wide, that mean completion if they are fine and even and distributed, that mean the material has found its final form and intends to hold it. The cracks on Sigrid's wall were fine and even and distributed. I could see this from the rise, in the March morning light that came low and bright across the slope. She stood there looking at it for a long time. Then she went inside, and I rode north, and the spring came on as it always does. Not as a gift and not as a reward, but as the next thing, arriving in its order, the way the next thing always arrives if you have done the work that the previous thing required of you.